The cursor blinked over the executive medical insurance renewals. Just routine paperwork for the company. Then the blood types on the screen stopped my breath. My father was type O. My mother was type O. My own file stared back at me with two letters that made the room spin. Type AB. Biologically impossible. The blue light from the monitor cast a harsh glare on my trembling hands. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and forced my fingers to close the laptop. 30 years of family history, completely erased by a basic biology fact. The next morning, the confrontation in the dining room played out with chilling silence. My parents sat across the long mahogany table. I slid the printed medical files next to my mother's pristine, empty porcelain teacup. She glanced at the papers, took a slow sip of her black coffee, and met my gaze, without a single flinch. "You should be grateful to be a Rowan," she said. Her voice was completely flat. She treated a lifetime of deception like a minor human resources discrepancy. Finally being cleared up, my father just turned the page of his newspaper. The absolute lack of empathy hit me like a physical blow. The desperate daughter in me died right there, in that dining room. A cold, calculated strategist took her place, Celeste Rowan. For 30 years, I believed that name meant something. At 30 years old, as the head of strategy for the Rowan Agricultural Group, I finally understood the truth. I built my entire life around securing this empire. When I was 16, they gave me a corporate law textbook for my birthday, while my cousins got cars and ski trips. I thought it was preparation for leadership. I thought I was the chosen successor. I was actually just the workhorse. The timing of their little revelation clicked into place with horrifying precision. Just last week, I finalized a brutal, grueling legal restructuring for the company. Months of sleepless nights, running entirely on black coffee and adrenaline. Hundreds of pages of complex trust contracts. That restructuring locked all executive voting rights securely within the core Rowan group. I signed the final papers on Thursday. My parents casually admitted my adoption on Tuesday. The strategy was breathtakingly cruel. They used my brain to build an impenetrable fortress around the family assets, and the exact second the cement dried, they locked me outside. My phone vibrated against the desk. A formal calendar invite from my father popped onto the screen. Emergency board meeting. Subject: executive restructuring. He was officially moving to oust me. The betrayal tasted bitter, like old pennies on my tongue. I shoved my chair back and headed for the hallway to get some air. The elevator doors dinged. Uncle Graham stepped out. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a smirk that made my skin crawl. He stopped right in my path, forcing me to halt. The heavy, suffocating scent of his expensive cologne hung in the corridor. "Tough morning, Celeste," he murmured. His voice dripped with condescension. "You should really start looking into other careers outside of agriculture. Maybe something a bit less demanding." He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes practically gleaming with victory, and strolled past me towards the executive suite. He was already measuring my office for his furniture. I gripped the edge of the hallway water cooler. The plastic dug into my palms. The reality of my entire existence crashed down on me. I was never a daughter to them. I was a legally required puzzle piece. They adopted me to bypass a loophole, shoving me into the corporate structure to keep the power exactly where they wanted it. I was a load-bearing pillar, and now that the roof was secure, they were bringing in the wrecking ball. I spun on my heel and walked straight back to my office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I threw the deadbolt. I dropped into my leather chair and pulled my keyboard close. My fingers flew across the keys. I bypassed the standard servers and accessed the deep storage archives. I initiated a secure, encrypted backup protocol to my personal drive. Every single board meeting minute, every email thread between my father and Graham, every structural document, amendment, and financial forecast I had drafted over the last 5 years. The progress bar crawled across the screen, a slow, steady blue line of ammunition. The family was preparing to ambush an unarmed girl. They had no idea they were walking into a minefield. The bell above the diner door jingled. The smell of stale coffee and burnt toast hung in the air. Julian sat perfectly still in the back booth. He was my late grandfather's independent attorney, fiercely loyal, aging, but sharp as broken glass. He slid a thick, Yellowed envelope across the scratched Formica table. His knuckles were bone white. Your grandfather knew this day would come. Julian rasped. He just needed you to see them for who they really are first. I tore the seal. The paper felt brittle under my fingertips. It was the full, unredacted Arthur Rowan Master Trust. For decades, my parents only presented a heavily summarized version to the board. I scanned the dense legal text. One specific clause stopped my breath. Voting control did not belong to the legally recognized heir. It belonged exclusively to the direct, biological descendant of Evelyn Rowan, my mother's older sister, the aunt who tragically passed away 30 years ago, the aunt whose baby supposedly died shortly after birth. The puzzle clicked together. My parents adopted a child specifically to insert a controllable proxy into the legal structure. They bypassed the trust's true intent. I left the diner and drove straight back to the corporate tower. I bypassed the IT department entirely and used my executive clearance to pull the 30-year-old financial archives. I scrolled through localized ledgers from the exact year of my birth, rows of tractor purchases, seed distribution costs, property taxes. Then, a glaring anomaly jumped off the screen. A massive cash payout to a private midwife. No hospital stamps. No standard medical billing codes, just 4 words logged under administrative expenses. Private Rowan matter. They bought someone's silence. 3 hours later, I pushed open the door to room 214 at a modest assisted living facility. The midwife was 80 years old. She sat in a faded floral armchair, clutching a knitted blanket. She put up a fierce defensive wall the second I mentioned the Rowan family name. I reached into my coat pocket. I slid a photograph of Evelyn Rowan across the small table. The old woman stared at the picture. Her chin trembled. She buried her face in her hands and wept. The physical toll of a 30-year secret shattered her resolve. The truth spilled out in a terrified whisper. Evelyn's baby survived. She was born perfectly healthy. But my adoptive parents realized Evelyn's bloodline would cut them out of the company's control entirely. They drugged Evelyn. They stole the newborn. They faked the death certificates. Months later, they adopted the child back under a new name. Me. I was not a stranger they bought to steal the company. I was the true heir they stole to keep the company. The cruelty ran even deeper. Evelyn lived for 11 more years, heavily medicated down the hall, grieving a dead child while I was raised right under her roof. They broke my mother. Today, I am the one holding the hammer. Julian had given me an old silver locket belonging to Evelyn. Several strands of her hair were still caught in the metal clasp. I paid a private lab double to rush a genetic test. The results hit my inbox at exactly midnight. A 99.9% maternal match. I printed the lab results. I printed the unredacted trust. I printed the old ledger and the midwife's sworn affidavit. I stacked the papers meticulously and slid them into a single plain manila envelope. The guillotine was sharp. I was ready to drop the blade. The boardroom doors clicked shut with a heavy, final thud. The tension hung thick over the long mahogany table. My father sat at the head, practically radiating smugness. Uncle Graham leaned back in his leather chair, already eyeing my seat with blatant hunger. My father stood up. He grabbed the remote and clicked the projector. A blown-up image of my sealed adoption certificate plastered the white wall. The board members shifted in their seats. Hushed whispers erupted down the line. Celeste is not a true Rowan by blood, my father announced. His voice boomed with practiced, hollow authority. She has done excellent work with our recent restructuring. However, to preserve the sanctity of the family legacy, we must remove her from the executive board immediately. Her voting rights will transfer directly to Graham. My mother smirked from across the table. They thought they held the ultimate winning hand. They thought they just publicly humiliated me into submission. They expected me to beg for my job. I pressed my palms flat against the cool wood of the table. I held my breath and let the silence stretch out. Every eye in the room darted toward me, waiting for a breakdown, waiting for a tearful, desperate defense. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out the plain manila envelope and slid it straight down the center of the table. It stopped inches from my father's hands. You are absolutely right, I said. My voice echoed in the quiet room. I am adopted. But you forgot to read Grandpa Arthur's original trust to the board. The lead corporate counsel picked up the envelope. He pulled out the first document, the unredacted master trust. He cleared his throat and read the highlighted clause aloud. Voting control belongs exclusively to the direct biological descendant of Evelyn Rowan. My father's smug smile vanished. Confusion twisted his features. The heavy boardroom doors swung open. Julian stepped over the threshold. The old lawyer adjusted his tie and locked eyes with my father. By presenting fraudulent adoption papers to manipulate this board, you just triggered the trust's failsafe. Julian stated, all executive voting shares are frozen immediately. Graham shot out of his chair. His face flushed, bright red. She is an outsider, he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. She has no claim. I tapped the second stack of papers resting in front of the council. The 30-year-old ledger, the midwife's sworn affidavit, the DNA lab results proving a 99.9% match. The counsel read the affidavit silently. The color drained completely from his face. He looked at my parents like they were diseased. He slid the papers toward the center for everyone to see. You did not adopt a stranger to bypass the rules, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. Every word hit like a hammer. You stole Evelyn's baby. You stole me. The boardroom erupted into absolute horror. Board members physically pushed their chairs back, recoiling from my parents. My father collapsed heavily into his seat, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Sheer, unadulterated panic widened his eyes. My mother turned the color of ash. Her hands shook violently. They were no longer untouchable executives. They were exposed kidnappers. Their entire empire was burning to the ground right in front of them. Ignited by their own paperwork, I gathered my briefcase and stood up. I looked down at the two people who stole my life. You spent 30 years guarding a throne that was already mine. I turned my back on them and walked out. The fallout struck with brutal, absolute precision. The board of directors voted unanimously to suspend my adoptive parents and Uncle Graham before I even reached the parking garage. By noon the next day, federal investigators swarmed the corporate headquarters. They seized hard drives and banking records. Warrants were issued for kidnapping, wire fraud, and falsifying death certificates. The flashing red and blue lights of federal vehicles painted the glass walls of the lobby. I stood on the sidewalk and watched an agent escort my father out in handcuffs. His face was pale. His head hung heavy. The arrogant smirk was completely wiped away. That evening, the silence in my apartment carried a new, clean weight. Julian arrived just after 8 o'clock. He carried a small, weathered wooden box. Inside lay dozens of envelopes, their edges frayed with time. They were letters written by Evelyn during her 11 years of captivity, addressed to the daughter she was told had died. I slid the final letter from its sleeve. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was elegant and steady. If you ever find out who you are, do not think they gave you the Rowan name. It was always yours. A tear slipped down my cheek and hit the parchment. The heavy, suffocating chain I dragged around for 30 years snapped in half. 6 months later, the toxic holding company was a ghost. I took my seat at the head of the boardroom. The brass plaque outside the door now read Evelyn Agricultural. We purged the executive bloat. We promoted managers based strictly on merit. The fields outside the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched out, green and thriving under honest leadership. I walked past the empty offices that used to belong to my captors. A dusty family portrait still hung on the far wall. The glass captured my father's fake smile and my mother's cold eyes. I pulled the frame off the hook. I carried it down the hallway and dropped it straight into the metal recycling bin. The glass shattered against the bottom. I walked back to my desk, finally ready to get to work. The wheels of federal justice turned slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 18 months after that boardroom meeting, the gavel finally fell. The judge sentenced my adoptive father to 12 years in federal prison for corporate fraud and crossing state lines to commit kidnapping. My adoptive mother received 9 years as an accessory and co-conspirator. Uncle Graham, who spent his entire defense trying to broker a plea deal by throwing his own brother under the bus, still received 5 years for his part in the financial cover-up. The court also ordered a combined restitution of $8,400,000. The federal government effectively liquidated their private estates, their vacation homes, and their hidden offshore accounts. The fallout in our community was absolute. These were people who used to sit in the front pews of the local church and host lavish charity galas. Overnight, the hospital board quietly unscrewed their brass names from the donation walls. The local agricultural union, the very people my parents stepped on for decades, publicly severed all ties with them. The elite country club revoked their memberships. They lost their freedom. But worse than that, they lost their pristine, manufactured reputation. They became a cautionary tale, whispered at dinner parties. 14 months into her sentence, a piece of standard-issue prison mail arrived at my office. The handwriting on the envelope belonged to my adoptive mother. I sat at my new desk, overlooking the sprawling green fields, and sliced the paper open. The letter was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. She wrote about the sacrifices she made. She claimed she took me in to give me a better life. She ended the 2-page ramble with a single, desperate line: "I am still your mother, and I know you still love me." A year ago, those words would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and rage. I would have drafted a furious reply. I would have screamed at the paper. Now, I just stared at the blue ink. My pulse stayed perfectly steady. The anger was gone. The sense of obligation evaporated. The woman who wrote those words was a complete stranger to me. I folded the letter perfectly in half, walked over to the corner of my office, and dropped it into the paper shredder. The machine whirred for 3 seconds. Then, silence. I turned my attention back to the quarterly reports. My afternoon continued, without a single interruption. My life looks very different today. The Evelyn Agricultural Group does not run on fear and paranoia. We run on transparency. The heavy, suffocating mahogany furniture in the executive suite is gone, replaced by glass doors and natural light. I also built a family of my own choosing. Julianne, the fiercely loyal attorney who held onto my grandfather's truth for 3 decades, now serves as my chief advisor. He brings his golden retriever into the office on Fridays. We moved the old midwife out of that bleak assisted living facility and placed her in a premier, private care home, fully funded by the company's new charitable foundation. I visit her every Sunday. We sit in the sunroom, and she tells me stories about my real mother, stories about Evelyn's laugh, her kindness, and the way she loved the rain. I am finally getting to know the woman whose blood runs through my veins. The toxic noise of my past has been replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of people who actually care about me. I sleep through the night now. My shoulders do not carry the weight of an empire built on lies. I just carry the legacy of a mother who loved me. For 30 years, I believed my worth was defined by how well I fit into a space carved out for me by my abusers. I believed gratitude meant allowing myself to be used. But the truth I uncovered in that boardroom was a terrifying, liberating autopsy of narcissistic abuse. Narcissists do not build families. They build systems of utility. To them, children are not human beings with souls. We are puzzle pieces, legal proxies, or meat shields. The cognitive dissonance required to steal a child from its mother, raise it in the same house, and convince yourself you are the hero of the story is staggering. If you are listening to this, I need you to understand 3 rules for surviving people like this. Rule number 1: family is a verb, not a legal contract. Blood does not make you family. But ironically, neither does adoption if it is rooted in deceit and control. True family is found in the people who protect your truth. If someone constantly demands your gratitude for the bare minimum of human decency, they are not treating you like family. They are treating you like a hostage. Rule number 2: the ultimate revenge is absolute. Silent documentation. Toxic people thrive on your emotional reactions. They want you to cry. They want you to scream. They want you to look crazy, so they can play the victim to the outside world. You defeat them by removing your emotion completely. You defeat them with dates, signatures, bank routing numbers, and cold, hard facts. You let their own paper trail become the rope they hang themselves with. Justice is loudest when it is completely silent. Rule number 3. You do not have to forgive the people who broke you in order to heal. Society loves to push the narrative of forced forgiveness, especially when it comes to family. But some actions are unforgivable. Some bridges are meant to be burned all the way to the ground, so the monsters can never follow you across. My healing did not come from understanding my captors, it came from completely severing them from my life and reclaiming the identity they tried to erase. Healing is taking the broken pieces of your history and building a fortress they can never enter. You do not owe loyalty to the people who manipulate you. You owe loyalty to the truth. Have you ever realized you were just a pawn in someone else's toxic game? How did you break the board? Share your story in the comments below. Send this to someone who needs the courage to stop being a pawn, walk away from the table, and build their own empire. I am Celeste Rowan, the true heir of Evelyn, and I am finally free.